The news arrived like a thunderclap in the darkness. On August 6, 1945, 10 German scientists sat in the genteel confines of Farmhall, a Georgian manor house in the English countryside that had been converted into a gilded cage. These were not ordinary prisoners of war. They were the intellectual architects of Nazi Germany's nuclear ambitions, physicists whose names carried weight in the international scientific community. Werner Heisenberg, Otto Hahn, Max von Laue, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, men who had spent years attempting to split the atom for the Third Reich, now confined under British intelligence surveillance as part of Operation Epsilon, unaware that their conversations were being meticulously recorded through hidden microphones embedded in every room. The manor was comfortable, almost luxurious by wartime standards. There were books, scientific journals, a piano, decent food, a stark contrast to the rubble and ruin that Germany had become. But beneath the veneer of hospitality lay a carefully orchestrated psychological operation. The British and Americans wanted answers. They needed to understand how close Nazi Germany had come to developing an atomic bomb, what these scientists knew, what they had accomplished, and perhaps most crucially, how they would react when confronted with the reality that their enemies had succeeded where they had failed. When the BBC broadcast the news that evening, the reaction was immediate and visceral. An atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. A single weapon had devastated an entire city. The age of nuclear warfare had arrived, but it had arrived in American hands, not German ones. In that moment, in that English manor house, the psychological architecture of these men began to collapse under the weight of a realization that would reshape their understanding of themselves, their work, and their place in history. The initial response was disbelief bordering on denial. Otto Hahn, the Nobel laureate who had discovered nuclear fission in 1938, was physically devastated. His face drained of color as the implications settled over him like a shroud. This was his discovery, his scientific achievement, now weaponized on a scale that defied comprehension. The man who had unlocked the atom's secrets found himself confronting the most terrible application of that knowledge. He spoke of suicide. He paced the rooms like a condemned man, muttering about the hundreds of thousands who must have died, about his responsibility, about the horror he had unwittingly enabled. But Hahn's moral anguish was not universally shared among his colleagues. Werner Heisenberg, the brilliant theoretical physicist who had led Germany's uranium project, responded with a different emotion entirely. Skepticism tinged with wounded professional pride. "I don't believe it," he stated flatly. The Americans couldn't possibly have developed a functional atomic bomb. The technical challenges were too immense, the theoretical hurdles too complex. Heisenberg had spent years grappling with these problems, and if Germany's finest scientific minds couldn't solve them, how could the Americans, whom Nazi propaganda had consistently portrayed as intellectually inferior, have succeeded? This reaction revealed something profound about the psychological state of these men. They existed in a cognitive prison far more restrictive than the physical walls of Farmhall. Years of ideological conditioning, professional hubris, and the insular nature of wartime research had created a worldview in which German scientific supremacy was axiomatic. The very notion that Anglo-American scientists could have outpaced them seemed to violate the natural order of things as they understood it. Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker offered a different interpretation, one that would become central to the mythology these scientists would construct in the years that followed. Perhaps, he suggested, the German failure was not actually a failure at all. Perhaps they had deliberately avoided developing the bomb because they understood its moral implications. Perhaps their inability to present Hitler with a nuclear weapon was actually a form of passive resistance, a quiet act of conscience in the face of totalitarian evil. This narrative would prove remarkably durable, despite its questionable relationship to historical reality. The recordings from Farmhall tell a more complex and uncomfortable story, one of scientists who had indeed worked toward creating an atomic bomb for Nazi Germany, who had failed not for moral reasons but for technical, organizational, and resource-based ones, and who now found themselves confronting the possibility that history would remember them not as the pioneers of nuclear physics, but as the men who lost the atomic race to their enemies. As that first evening wore on, the conversations grew more animated, more defensive, more desperate. Technical discussions mixed with moral justifications, professional analysis blended with personal anguish. They scrutinized every detail of the BBC broadcast, searching for evidence that might support their skepticism, that might allow them to maintain some fragment of their shattered professional identity.
And in those conversations, recorded for posterity by intelligence services who understood that these men's psychological responses might be as valuable as any technical intelligence, we can hear the sound of a worldview collapsing in real time.
The psychology of denial is a powerful mechanism, particularly among men whose entire identities are constructed upon intellectual superiority. As the night deepened at Farm Hall, the German scientists began a frantic technical post-mortem, not of their own failure, but of the supposed impossibility of what the Americans claimed to have achieved. The hidden microphones captured every word, as these men, stripped of laboratories and resources, attempted to reconstruct in their minds the physics of a weapon they insisted could not exist. It was a masterclass in cognitive dissonance, a real-time demonstration of how brilliant minds can contort reality to protect the ego from unbearable truths. Heisenberg took command of the discussion with characteristic confidence. He moved to a blackboard and began scribbling calculations, his colleagues gathering around like disciples seeking reassurance from a prophet. The numbers, he insisted, simply didn't work. The critical mass required for a uranium-235 bomb would be enormous, perhaps several tons. The enrichment process would require industrial facilities on a scale that even America's vast resources couldn't possibly have achieved during wartime. He calculated, recalculated, his chalk scratching across the board with increasing urgency, each equation another brick in the defensive wall he was constructing against reality. But there was something desperate in these calculations, something that revealed the true nature of their predicament. These were not objective scientific inquiries. They were psychological life rafts for men drowning in the implications of their own obsolescence. Otto Hahn watched Heisenberg's performance with growing despair, understanding perhaps more clearly than his colleagues that the moral weight of nuclear weapons didn't diminish simply because Germany hadn't been the one to deploy them. If anything, his anguish deepened as he realized that his discovery of fission had led to this moment, regardless of national boundaries, that the genie he had released from the bottle recognized no allegiance to any flag. The recordings reveal something else, a subtle but unmistakable current of resentment. How had the Americans done it? More importantly, who had done it? As the night progressed, the German scientists began piecing together the answer, and it was perhaps more painful than the technological defeat itself. The Manhattan Project, they gradually realized, had been led by refugees, many of them Jews who had fled Nazi persecution, Enrico Fermi, who had left fascist Italy, Niels Bohr, who had escaped occupied Denmark, and of course the Hungarian Jews, Leo Szilard, Edward Teller, Eugene Wigner. Even Albert Einstein, though not directly involved in weapons development, had lent his name and prestige to the initial warnings that prompted American action. The irony was savage and inescapable. Nazi Germany's racial ideology had purged its universities and research institutions of Jewish physics, driving away some of the most brilliant scientific minds of the generation. The regime that had proclaimed Aryan intellectual supremacy had systematically expelled the very people who would ultimately ensure its defeat. And now, those exiled scientists had helped create a weapon that rendered Nazi Germany's conventional military power, even at its height, completely obsolete. The 1,000-year Reich had been undone not just by Allied armies, but by the very people it had deemed racially inferior and driven into exile. Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, politically astute in ways that pure theoreticians like Heisenberg were not, began constructing what would become the central pillar of German nuclear scientists' post-war mythology. In conversations recorded that night, he floated the idea that perhaps they had never truly wanted to succeed. Perhaps at some unconscious level they had dragged their feet, made the project seem more difficult than it was, steered resources away from weapons development and toward pure research. It was, he suggested, a form of internal sabotage, moral resistance disguised as technical incompetence. This narrative was seductive precisely because it offered psychological salvation. It transformed failure into virtue, incompetence into conscience. Rather than being remembered as the scientists who lost the atomic race, they could position themselves as the men who had refused to give Hitler the ultimate weapon, who had preserved their moral integrity even while working within the Nazi system. It was a story that allowed them to sleep at night, a story that would be elaborated and refined in the decades to come, a story that would find sympathetic audiences in a post-war world eager for narratives of resistance and redemption. But the recordings from Farm Hall suggest a more uncomfortable truth. These men had indeed tried to develop an atomic bomb for Nazi Germany. They had held conferences, submitted proposals, requested funding, conducted experiments. Their failure was not moral, but technical, organizational, and circumstantial.
Germany's uranium project had been fragmented, under-resourced, and ultimately undermined by the chaos of total war. The scientists had made critical miscalculations, particularly regarding the amount of fissile material required, that had led them down unproductive paths. And crucially, they had lacked the industrial capacity, the centralized coordination, and the sense of desperate urgency that had characterized the Manhattan Project. As dawn approached at Farm Hall, the conversations took on a different character. The initial shock was giving way to a more complex emotional landscape, a mixture of professional humiliation, moral anxiety, and the first stirrings of self-protective myth-making. These men understood that they would be judged by history, that their wartime work would be scrutinized, that questions would be asked about what they knew, what they intended, what they achieved, and why they failed. The answers they were beginning to formulate in that English manor house would shape their public personas for the rest of their lives.
The days following the Hiroshima announcement transformed Farm Hall into a pressure cooker of recrimination, rationalization, and raw psychological exposure. The British intelligence officers monitoring the hidden microphones documented a fascinating deterioration in the social dynamics among the detained scientists. What had been a collegial atmosphere of enforced proximity now fractured along fault lines of ego, ideology, and self-preservation. Each man processed the atomic reality differently, and those differences revealed not just individual psychology, but the broader moral bankruptcy of the system they had served. Werner Heisenberg's response evolved from disbelief into something more calculated, a defensive restructuring of historical narrative that would serve him for decades. As technical details about the Hiroshima bomb began filtering through news reports, he could no longer maintain the fiction that it was Allied propaganda or exaggeration. The weapon was real. The Americans had succeeded. But Heisenberg began constructing an alternative framework. Perhaps the German scientists had been working on something fundamentally different. Not a bomb exactly, but a nuclear reactor, a peaceful application of atomic energy that just happened to be developed during wartime. The distinction was semantic, almost laughably transparent, but it offered psychological cover. What the recordings captured was Heisenberg's methodical rewriting of his own intentions. He began describing conversations with Albert Speer and other Nazi officials in which he claimed to have emphasized the difficulties, to have downplayed the weapon's potential, to have subtly steered the program away from military applications. Whether these recollections were genuine or manufactured, whether Heisenberg was lying to his colleagues, to the microphones, or to himself, remains one of the great unresolved questions of scientific history. What is certain is that a pattern emerged, the creation of a usable past, a version of events that allowed these men to live with themselves and face the post-war world with some semblance of dignity intact. Otto Hahn's trajectory was markedly different. His moral anguish appeared genuine, unfiltered by the defensive mechanisms that protected his colleagues. He had discovered nuclear fission in 1938, publishing his findings just months before the war began. That discovery had made everything else possible: the Manhattan Project, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the entire nuclear age that was now dawning. Unlike Heisenberg, Hahn couldn't retreat into technical ambiguities or claims of passive resistance. His contribution was too fundamental, too direct. The blood of Hiroshima, he believed, was on his hands, regardless of national allegiance or wartime circumstance. The recordings captured Hahn's despondency in brutal detail. He spoke of being unable to continue living, of the impossibility of reconciling his life's work with its ultimate application. His colleagues attempted to console him, to distribute the moral burden more evenly, but Hahn's guilt seemed to operate on a different register entirely. He understood something that perhaps the others did not or would not, that the scientific enterprise itself, divorced from moral considerations and placed in service of totalitarian regimes, inevitably produces monstrous outcomes. The question wasn't whether individual scientists had good or bad intentions. It was whether science conducted under fascism could ever be anything but complicit. Max von Laue, the oldest among them and perhaps the most politically clear-sighted, offered a different perspective. He had never been a Nazi, had maintained professional relationships with Jewish colleagues even after it became dangerous, and had quietly resisted the regime's attempts to corrupt physics with ideological nonsense about German science versus Jewish science. His response to Hiroshima was neither Heisenberg's defensive rationalization nor Hahn's paralyzing guilt. Instead, von Laue seemed to recognize the moment for what it was: the definitive end of German scientific preeminence, the consequence of years of ideological purges and political interference in research. What emerges from the Farm Hall transcripts is a portrait of men confronting not just technical defeat, but existential obsolescence. They had believed themselves to be at the center of scientific progress, the vanguard of human knowledge. Now they sat in comfortable captivity while their enemies, including scientists they had dismissed, expelled, or worse, had achieved what they could not.
The psychological injury went beyond professional pride. It struck at the core of their identities as Germans, as scientists, as men who had convinced themselves they were serving something larger than Nazi barbarism. The conversation turned, inevitably, to the future. What would become of them? Would they be tried as war criminals? The scientists who had worked on the V2 rocket program, Werner von Braun and his team, where were they now? Rumors suggested they had been captured by the Americans and were already being courted for their expertise. Would the same opportunity extend to nuclear physicists, or was their failure too complete, their value too diminished? The prospect of irrelevance, of being historical footnotes to a scientific achievement they had neither completed nor prevented, seemed in some ways more terrifying than the prospect of prosecution. Kurt Diebner, who had led the Army Ordnance Office's uranium program in competition with Heisenberg's group, offered the most nakedly self-interested analysis. He had always been more engineer than theoretician, more interested in practical results than elegant equations. His response to Hiroshima was pragmatic: study what the Americans had done, understand where the German program had gone wrong, position themselves as valuable resources for whoever would listen. It was a survival instinct that would prove prescient. Within years, both American and Soviet programs would be recruiting German scientists, their wartime allegiances conveniently forgotten in the calculus of Cold War competition. As August stretched on and news of Nagasaki arrived, a second atomic bomb, this one using plutonium rather than uranium, the last vestiges of denial evaporated. The Americans hadn't just built one experimental weapon. They had developed an industrial-scale nuclear weapons program with multiple approaches, multiple designs, multiple bombs ready for deployment. The scale of the achievement was staggering, and it definitively answered any lingering questions about German scientific competitiveness. The war had been lost not just militarily, but intellectually, not just on battlefields, but in laboratories, not just by soldiers, but by scientists.
The legacy of Farm Hall extends far beyond those recorded conversations in the summer of 1945. It represents the moment when scientific ambition confronted its darkest consequences and began the long, uncomfortable process of self-justification. What the German scientists experienced in that English manor was not simply the shock of technological defeat, but a profound reckoning with complicity. They had worked within a genocidal regime, had accepted its funding, had attended its conferences, had worn its uniforms or accepted its honors. Some, like Heisenberg, had met with Nazi leadership and discussed the potential of atomic weapons. Others had been more passive, more removed from the direct machinery of state violence, but none could claim complete innocence. The atomic bombs dropped on Japan forced them to confront what their own success would have meant. Hitler armed with nuclear weapons, the Holocaust conducted under an atomic umbrella, a Nazi empire rendered militarily invincible by the very science they had pursued. The psychological defense mechanisms developed at Farm Hall would solidify into what historians now call the Heisenberg mythology, a narrative that German nuclear scientists had deliberately sabotaged their own weapons program through subtle resistance and moral qualms. This story found fertile ground in post-war Germany, a nation desperate for narratives of resistance, for evidence that not everyone had enthusiastically embraced Nazi ideology. Heisenberg himself would spend decades refining this account, giving lectures, writing memoirs, positioning himself as a man who had walked a moral tightrope, staying engaged with the regime just enough to prevent more fanatical scientists from succeeding where he had failed. But the Farm Hall transcripts, kept secret by British intelligence until 1992, tell a more ambiguous and troubling story. They reveal scientists who had indeed pursued atomic weapons, who had been frustrated by resource constraints and technical miscalculations rather than moral reservations, who had underestimated the difficulty of uranium enrichment and overestimated the critical mass required for a weapon. The failure of the German nuclear program was not a triumph of conscience. It was a combination of fragmented organization, insufficient industrial capacity, Allied bombing campaigns that disrupted research, and critical scientific errors that sent the program down unproductive paths. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Farm Hall recordings is what they reveal about the psychology of scientific responsibility. These men had devoted their lives to understanding the fundamental forces of nature, to pursuing knowledge for its own sake. They saw themselves as apolitical seekers of truth, their work existing in a realm separate from the messy brutality of politics and war. But Hiroshima and Nagasaki destroyed that illusion forever. The atomic bomb proved that science conducted in service of the state, any state, inevitably becomes complicit in that state's actions. There is no neutral ground, no purely theoretical space where knowledge exists without consequence.
Otto Hahn's breakdown at Farmhall represented the clearest acknowledgement of this reality. His discovery of nuclear fission had been motivated by pure scientific curiosity, published openly in academic journals, offered to the world as a contribution to human understanding. Yet within 7 years, that discovery had been weaponized and used to incinerate 2 Japanese cities. The connection between his laboratory bench in 1938 and the ruins of Hiroshima in 1945 was direct and undeniable. No amount of rationalization about military necessity, strategic calculation, or ending the war could erase the fundamental truth. Knowledge has consequences, and scientists bear responsibility for how their discoveries are used. The other scientists at Farmhall wrestled with this reality in different ways. Some, like Heisenberg, constructed elaborate narratives that preserved their self-image as men of integrity operating under impossible circumstances. Others retreated into technical discussions, finding refuge in equations and calculations that offered clear answers in a world suddenly devoid of moral clarity. A few, like von Laue, seemed to accept their complicity while recognizing the broader systemic failures that had made such complicity possible. But all of them understood, at some level, that the old model of scientific work, the romantic notion of the lone genius pursuing truth wherever it might lead, had been permanently shattered. The post-war careers of the Farmhall scientists reflected these divergent responses to moral crisis. Heisenberg returned to Germany and became a prominent voice in physics education and atomic policy, carefully cultivating his image as a man who had resisted from within. Hahn received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1944, announced while he was detained at Farmhall, and spent his later years advocating for nuclear disarmament and wrestling publicly with the moral implications of his discovery. Von Laue continued his research while maintaining a dignified silence about his wartime experiences. Others faded into obscurity, their contributions forgotten or deliberately erased from a scientific history that preferred cleaner narratives. What makes the Farmhall episode so significant is not just what it reveals about these individual men, but what it illuminates about the relationship between science, state power, and moral responsibility. The German scientists had convinced themselves they were pursuing knowledge, but they were actually serving a regime committed to racial extermination and totalitarian domination. The American scientists who built the atomic bomb told themselves they were stopping Hitler, but they created a weapon that would threaten human extinction for generations. Both groups faced the same fundamental question. Can scientists claim moral neutrality when their work is funded, directed, and ultimately weaponized by state power? The recordings from Farmhall capture the precise moment when this question became inescapable. The shock on those scientists' faces when they heard about Hiroshima was not just professional humiliation or nationalistic disappointment. It was the recognition that the atomic age had arrived, that humanity now possessed the means of its own annihilation, and that they, as scientists, bore a special responsibility for this new reality. Whether they had succeeded or failed in building the bomb was almost irrelevant. The knowledge existed, the physics had been demonstrated, and the world would never be the same. In the end, what went through the German scientists' minds at Farmhall was something more profound than defeat. It was the realization that they had been wrong about everything. Wrong about German superiority, wrong about the competence of their enemies, wrong about the possibility of maintaining scientific neutrality in a totalitarian system, and perhaps most painfully, wrong about themselves. They had thought they were the protagonists of scientific history, but Hiroshima revealed them to be supporting characters in someone else's story. A story that would be written by the exiles they had helped drive away, by the democratic societies they had dismissed as decadent, by the very people Nazi ideology had declared inferior. The mushroom cloud over Hiroshima cast a shadow that reached all the way to that English countryside, forcing these men to confront not just what they had failed to achieve, but what they had been willing to attempt, and for whom. That shadow would follow them for the rest of their lives, an indelible mark of complicity that no amount of post-war rationalization could fully erase. The age of nuclear weapons had begun, and they would be forever remembered not as its architects, but as the men who had tried and failed to give the atomic bomb to Adolf Hitler.